I am really excited to introduce our next speaker. With her team at Radiant Generation, our next speaker has implemented 200 plus compliance programs. Can you imagine? Completed 40 plus NERC compliance audits in all 6 regions. Again, I can't imagine. She's established 3 GOP control centers. But her priority is ensuring renewables are reliable participants on the grid. And she spends a lot of time talking about that online and with people like us. So I'm excited to introduce her to talk about the challenges and opportunities of the resource mix and transmission planning. So please help me welcome Kelly McPherson. She's the Executive VP of Compliance and Risk at Radiant Generation.
We good? Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the WEC staff for inviting me. It's a privilege, and I recognize the honor of being here and being allowed to speak, and I'm really grateful, so thank you for that. I want to start with a story for you all. Some of you guys have heard some of this, and some of you haven't. And I think we often, great presentations this morning, and we need to dig into the details, the engineering side of things. But I think sometimes we forget about the human element of what we're doing and how important that is and how we're touching lives every single day. So I grew up, my dad was a control center operator at Southern California Edison in the Alhambra Control Center. And this is back before SIP days, right? Are we bad? Awesome, thank you. All right, is that better? Oh, we're live, okay. So my dad was a control operator at Southern California Edison, and this is before cybersecurity, so just remember, I'm dating myself here, but I used to go to work with my dad when I was like 5 years old, and it was so fun. And I'd go and I'd sit at the shift supervisor desk with him, and he'd send me over to, you guys remember the Richter scale and the dot matrix printer, and I'd pull down the paper and rip it off the dot matrix printer. It was the best. He'd bring those home, those dot matrix paper. Do you know what I'm talking about? And like the accordion style. Those were the best art projects ever, right? But I was really lucky. I was exposed to it from an early age from my dad. And, you know, it really impacted my life in a lot of different ways. And I think this is the human story we don't always get to hear. And this is the passion why I do what I do every single day. You guys remember in 1994, I was home with my brother babysitting, and my mom was at work and my dad was at work, and the power went out. And I was like, what's going on? Well, what do you do when you're 11 years old? You pick up the phone and you call dad at work because he runs the power, right? I'm like, Dad, the power's out at our house. What am I going to do? He's like, Kelly, I know. I'm working on it right now. I'm like, okay, got it. And our power was restored pretty quickly. This was the Northridge earthquake in January of 1994. And my dad, you know, the story goes something that, you know, each operator there, whoever had kids at home, they were working to restore, you know, their power quickly so operators could focus on their job and getting the grid back together, right? And that's the human story. You know, when California deregulated the market in 1997, my dad took a job as an operator at the California Independent System Operator. And we moved, and I was really mad because I was a freshman going into high school, and I had friends, and I had to go to a new school. But we moved, and it was really interesting to watch that change in our industry, right? And that deregulation, and watch the ISO get set up, and then to watch New England get set up, and New York get set up, and to be hopeful and excited about what this meant for the energy industry, right? And where we were headed. And gosh, are we really going to be able to pick our power like we can pick our telephone provider? That's how my dad explained it to me, right? And it was so interesting. And then I was really lucky. I was an intern at the California ISO in 2001 during the energy crisis. And I will tell you, how many of you guys in here are operators, like come with an operating background? A good amount of you in here? Yes. So you guys remember, you know, the pressure in the control room, right? I was really fortunate This is a defining moment for me. But in 2001, during the California energy crisis, I was working in new resource implementation, helping bring generation online, right? Like I would be answering phone calls in the morning and they'd be saying, hey, I've got a haunted generator. Can I connect to the grid? Like I want to help, right? Like so interesting. And I'd go home at night and I'd listen to the news and I'd hear what I was working on during the day. And so one night, I was lucky to get to stay in the control center that night, and I was shadowing at the generation desk. And we were getting ready, going into the 10 o'clock operating hour. And you're looking at the generation stack, and you're realizing there's not enough generation for the next hour, right? And you start looking through your resources, and you're like, there's not enough secondary resources to pull in. There's not enough generation. We are not in a brownout situation. We're in a blackout situation. And I sat there with the operator, and we made phone calls. And what it boiled down to was there was 2 hospitals that needed to be tripped offline. There were 2 hospitals and one needed to be tripped offline. Made phone calls to each hospital. One hospital had tested its backup generator 4 days ago and was good to go. The other hospital was in the middle of a heart transplant surgery, and they had 30 minutes left on the life of that heart. The other hospital said, absolutely, trip me offline. We're good to go. That's the power of what you guys do every single day. That's why this conference is important. That's why NERC standards are important, because at the end of the day, this is about people's lives, right? And this is the human side of it that we don't talk about. And so I want to remind you guys, we're at the beginning of this conference. We're going to start digging in and talking about technical things. But you guys have to remember, you're dealing with people's lives, right? And it's so important, and there's value in what you're doing. And so I was so lucky to have these experiences, and they've shaped what I've done. They've shaped my professional life, what I do every single day, because I believe reliability is important, that we're impacting people's lives, and we need to do that. And so I spent a lot of time talking and trying to bridge the gap between these. We can joke in this room, right, and call them the finance bros of the solar world, right, like the renewables, and the utilities, right, and the regulators. And I spend my time bridging the gap between the two, because they're both come with important perspectives, but we got to have the big picture in mind. So I want to jump into kind of the details today, but I felt like it was really important for you guys to understand kind of the heart and mission behind what we're all doing, right? Like, how many of you guys remember the Northeast blackout in 2003, right? You guys all remember that. Like, that was a pivotal moment. There are so many pivotal moments. Everyone in this room has a story related to reliability, right? So as we dig in and we think about inverter-based resources and how they're going to affect the grid, we've experienced a lot of challenges, right? We've seen a lot of things reshaping the dynamics. I would argue last year at this conference, we were talking about grid transformation is coming, right? I think we're at the point that Kim was just filling me in on how many registrations we've had to date. And gosh, I would argue we are in grid transformation. It is here, right? And so because of that, we've really got to think about how are we going to be good stewards of the grid. So when we think about IBRs, you all know they reduce inertia, right? The grid events, they cascade faster, the recovery margins shrink. We have a weaker grid because of that, and stability is harder for us to work on. For those of you operators in the control center, I know that you feel this every single day, right? You have more voltage sensitivity on the grid than we've ever seen, more fault vulnerability. And then the variable output, the real-time balancing is more complex with those IBRs, with those synchronous machines. So you heard mention already today of Blue Cut Fire. I was like paying attention. I was like, how many times are we going to talk about Blue Cut Fire? I was like, I'm not going to talk about it, but I will mention, because I think this is important, the Palmdale disturbance in May of 2018. Anyone operating the grid during that event? That was a really interesting one that we don't talk a lot about, but that was one where a voltage dip caused multiple solar sites to disconnect over 1,200 megawatts, and it became that defining example of widespread inverters tripping from a single transmission fault. So that was a really interesting event that I think we haven't talked a lot about as an industry. That's a really great learning opportunity for us. So Each of these events are going to underscore the same thing. Low inertia, the tight IBR clustering, right? They all get built out where there's lots of land with no resources, or nothing is out there, right? And so they all end up clumping together. And because of that, we're going to see events that cascade through the grid even faster. So with all these challenges, I think, and this is the question I get a lot, especially from utilities on the regular. Why are we going with IBRs? Why is that happening? Why, like, if there's all these problems, why aren't we doing that? So I'm gonna take a step back for you guys. This is something we don't normally talk about a lot in this room, but I wanna give you guys a really quick policy update and what's happening at the state level and what we're seeing in the WEC interconnection, right? Because that's really important, because that's actually what is driving and motivating people to make these decisions, to build these facilities, right? That, and we'll talk in a little bit about the electron crisis. So just to remind you guys, we've got, when we think about the policy at a state level, in California, they've committed to carbon neutrality by 2045. That's a huge driver. That is a train that has left the station that we can't slow down, right? Washington's Big 7 climate policies, they have the mandate carbon neutral by 2030 and carbon zero by 2045. So what we're seeing is even more aggressive, right? Last year, if we had this conversation, we would have been talking about carbon neutral in 2030, but now we're talking about carbon zero, right? That's a big push. In Oregon, the House Bill 2021 mandates that electricity sold in Oregon has to be 100% non-emitting by 2040. And they had immediate reductions before you get to 2040. That's significant. And then Colorado passed HB 25-1269. The state has just as crazy numbers as we do with reliability standards and their laws. But they have decarbonization performance standards that have to be met by 2040. Okay. One cool thing about Colorado, where are my Colorado people at in here? What's super cool and happening in Colorado, which I'm excited to see kind of how that unfolds, is they've actually reclassified nuclear as clean energy, which if I'm sitting in my operator hat on in the control center, I'm excited about that, right? That's really exciting. But if you think about that, that's California, Washington, Oregon, and Colorado are all working to be carbon neutral by 2040. Well, what is that? Like how are we going to do that? Right? What does that mean? And the train's left the station. So it's not that we're ever going to slow down IBRs, right? We're never going to slow down the renewables. We're going to have to figure out how to work within that framework, right? And how to now work within this new grid that we found ourselves in. The other thing I think that's really interesting, and if you follow me on LinkedIn, you saw my last week, I gave you my hot take. I think we have a bit of an electron crisis in the US. I think we're at a place where it's going to be really challenging to meet the needs that we have coming. The AI demand, the data center demand, there's a huge demand for electricity that we are not prepared to meet. Enoch, that was super interesting when you're talking about how quick it is to build facilities earlier. And, we've seen just recently projects that have COD'd, the timeline, oh, there you are, the timeline for batteries, 10 months. From earth moving on the ground to commercial operation, not selling test energy, selling true full deliverability status under the ISO, California ISO, electrons in 10 months. And most recently a solar site in 17, a PV site in 17 months. So when we talk about that window of able to bring electrons onto the grid, super interesting, right? I'll tell you, I don't ever want to be that operator sitting in the control center with not enough electrons, right? That is the worst place to be in. Those brownouts and blackouts that we lived through in California during that energy crisis, it was life-changing for sure. So I think when you think about IBRs and renewables and, if you find yourself in that camp of well, why are we saying yes to that? I think there's two things that are really, really important to remember. One, there's policy pressure, right? There's pressure to deliver on all of these assets, right? To meet these carbonization requirements. And that's going to happen outside of whatever, we are not big enough as an industry to influence that, right? That's at a global level happening, right? So there's that. And then the second is the electron crisis. And the fastest way for us, and sort of unfortunately too, right, with the bureaucracy it takes to bring on a natural gas, a nuclear, or a coal facility, the fastest way to get electrons to the grid is going to be those renewable projects. So some perspective for you guys there. So here's what's really interesting. I wanted to bring this up because I think that we don't quite talk about the synergization with natural gas and the risk that we have. I think there's some of you here that we've definitely been talking about this, but I think as an industry, we haven't talked about this well. And so, especially in the Western Interconnect. So in the Western Interconnect, natural gas is the backbone of our interconnection, right? When we talk about having electrons, needing electrons and all of that, we're really looking at natural gas. So I'm going to kind of bring this full circle for you guys to think about the challenges that we have ahead of ourselves. So we have pressure politically to meet the decarbonization mandates, right? But we're also hedging grid stability with natural gas and balancing that solar and wind vulnerability. So I think there's 4 really important things that you guys need to know about natural gas. So first is there's supply constraints, right? So we have domestic gas production is strong, but the regional delivery can be limited. We have constraints in California and the Pacific Northwest. That was in the energy crisis 2001 in California. We had that donut, right, up in Northern California where you couldn't get the power. You couldn't, just turn on a natural gas facility because you had deliverability constraints, right? And then we also have infrastructure bottlenecks, and we're really in a place where we're actually supplying, not domestically, internationally, and that's placing constraints on our natural gas market as well. So we really have supply constraints that are challenging, right? So if you think about it, we're building on this variable resource that can be challenging to operate the grid with. We're backboning it with natural gas, but natural gas has its own challenges, right? So when you think about that, the next thing is the pipeline availability. The congestion, the maintenance, thinking about how old the natural gas pipelines are, they create a lot of short-term capacity challenges. The interdependency there, just one single pipeline event can really affect grid operations, right? Okay, so you've got supply constraints, pipeline availability. The third thing is weather events. I am so gonna not talk about cold weather events, right? Are we all just tired of talking about cold weather events at this point? I feel like we've, all that to say, cold weather affects gas, right? It drives up demand. It makes it hard. Now you have this constrained commodity that we're dealing with, okay? So then the interdependencies just are challenging. And I think it's even interesting. This is something we don't talk a lot about. I think, Texas and cold weather got a lot of hype, but we also have, how many of you guys remember in 2022, the SoCal gas constraints that we went through, where you really had this cross-sector vulnerability, there wasn't enough natural gas in Southern California in 2022. That was a really big deal. I think it was a little bit, cold weather in Texas was very loud at that point. So I think not a lot of people heard about it, but it was a big problem, right? That we had to navigate through as an industry. Okay, so, and then the fourth thing is the rising cost, right? And the uncertainty in the market prices, they really impact rate stability, and I'm not even going to scratch on the surface today of affordability of electricity, but it's a big deal, right? There's a human element to this as well, that we're building a grid and delivering on electricity that is affordable, thinking about that from the human aspect. So, as coal and thermal units retire, we have this over-reliance on natural gas, and it really increases exposure. So while it's a great solution, right? It solves for solar and wind variability, but natural gas doesn't have a long-term, is not necessarily maybe the greatest sole long-term solution, right? And so this is a concern we haven't solved for yet. And this is where I think some of our grid reliability conversations definitely need to be focused. We need to be solutioning the problem. And that's where, going kind of back to my soapbox, but this is why I think it's really important and why I work every day to bridge the gap between renewables and utilities, right? And the industry, because we can keep building renewables, we can keep delivering there, but we also have to do these other things that make the grid stable as well. It's not that renewables are the sole answer, it's that there has to be solutions that work together for everybody. So part of the solution, I think, for this is multi-layered. And you guys have we talked a little bit, danced around a little bit this morning, but you know, there's so many different types of resources that we could bring in. But we have to recognize those steady dispatchable generations with weather-driven variability. They shift how we plan and operate the grid, right? But we need to do a better job of explaining that to renewables so they understand how they're impacting it. We're now seeing the evolution. I was at a really huge renewable conference 2 weeks ago in Vegas, and the talk was battery storage plus PV. 15 years ago, that conference was called Solar Power International, and it was all about solar 15 years ago. But now what we're hearing is batteries, because the renewable industry is hearing what you guys are saying about grid reliability, and they're taking that and they're building battery storage projects, because battery storage projects reduce that variability, right? It changes that dynamic for renewables. And so that's really interesting. And I just make that point to you all to know that, like, folks in the renewable space want to be good stewards of the grid, but we need to empower them with the information so they can make great decisions on the development side. So I think we need to think about planning tools, storage, demand response. Everything has to continue to keep evolving. I think it was interesting in your guys' presentation earlier, thinking about, like, well, what are we modeling and how deep are we modeling it? And are we looking at it from all these layers, right? Like, there's so many layers to look at the data that we have. And even, you know, if you guys aren't participating in the industry and you aren't providing information, like, you miss the boat a little bit. You need to step into the industry, because that's what's so cool about what we do, is that we're built on the backbone of each and every one of you, and that your voice matters, and that the data that you provide is the best data that we could have. So I think it's really important that you guys are all thinking about how you fit into things on the grid. And so I think as we think about going forward, that data analysis is super important. We have a lot of modeling tools that are changing and growing and evolving with what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of machine learning coming in and helping to support the modeling on the renewable and interconnection side. We've seen some incredible things coming out of the California ISO. They're using BESS to manage evening ramps when the solar production decreases. So there's actually a really cool, it's 2024 special report on BESS that the California ISO put out there. That is an incredible report explaining a lot about how they're using batteries to handle that evening ramp, right? And I think being able to see that data and work together as an industry is so important, because if we're not looking at that, how are we ever going to meet the demands of the AI-driven tools for an accurate forecast, right? Those we're seeing that evolution constantly. I think, how many of you guys, you know, have Copilot deployed on your Outlook right now? Anyone? Or how many of you guys wish your IT department would approve Copilot because you might be in a SIP medium environment, so it's not allowed? But, you know, how many of you guys are using some type of AI tool right now in your day-to-day work life? Like, a lot of you, right? That's a lot of hands in the audience. Like, this is an evolution. It's, again, a train that's left the station that we're not going to be able to, you know, to change. So if you think about AI-driven solutions, the way our business is going, right? The way we do business is changing. What are we going to need? Electrons on the grid, right? Which means we need to model this data better and be able to understand the requirements that we have. So as we head into a new year in 26, and I'm excited about Jamie's presentation this afternoon. She's going to talk a lot about, I lost where she went in the room, but Jamie's going to talk a lot about NERC and the committees that they have and the standards that they're working on, and I'm really excited. I hope that you guys each take this as an opportunity to learn from her on the opportunities for you to dig in, right? Each one of you has an interesting perspective, and we need that perspective in the industry. So I think as we think about kind of bring this home a little bit, Jay Luke is no longer here, but if anyone from WEC is laughing with me on this, like the grid forming conversation, you could get stuck talking to Jay for hours about this. But, the inverter technology, it's mimicking those synchronous generators. It's providing that inertia and voltage support, and I sit in the room with those inverter manufacturers every week talking about settings on facilities they're building, talking about the new technology that they're building, the new version of their inverters that are coming out. And the first thing I'm saying in all those meetings is, what's the reliability impact? How are you affecting this, right? And so there is ways that we really can. So before you end up, as a utility, as a TOTOP with these inverters coming into your control center that you're trying to wrangle and manage, on the front end, we're working really hard to try to get those inverter manufacturers to make good choices in how they're programming inverters and how they're interacting with the grid, right? Making sure that was a huge push in the renewable industry that, probably was a little quiet to you guys, but, 2 years ago, there was a group of generators, of owners that pushed really, really hard on those key inverter manufacturers and said, we won't do business with you until you solution this, right? Until you can promise me and put in your contract that you are compliant with PRC 19 and 24, we're not signing a contract with you, right? And so that's the power of this community and understanding and bridging the gap. So if you guys are empowering us to understand what you're seeing in the control center, what you're seeing in your models, what you're seeing that grid stability and impact, we can then on the front end, as we're building these facilities, ensure that they're solutioning the problems that you guys are seeing every single day, right? And that's where this community really makes a lot of sense. So I want to kind of go back to the conversations that we talked about at the beginning. And I know each of you guys have your own stories about grid reliability, and grid transformation is here. It's not going to change. We have too much political pressure. We have too much need for electrons for us to ever kind of go backwards, right? But we're in this new place. And so I think the future of grid reliability is going to be built on the back of each and every person in this room, and each of you have a role to play to support us in getting to that reliable future. As we work through the event analysis that we see, as we work through, new versions of inverters and all of that, we need to be able to plug that into the work that WEC and NERC is doing. That event analysis is so important. The system we're operating today is not the same system from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? And so that means that we have to look at things differently. And, inverters-based resources are here. They're growing fast. We can't afford to stay in that analysis paralysis, right? We've got to get working together as a community, and we've got to be willing to, roll up our sleeves and figure that out. So I think, going forward, as you're thinking about 26, I would encourage you, as you're working, I don't know if anyone else is like me, but is in budget planning season for next year right now. But you're thinking about, what software tools do you need to be able to do your job better to respond to what you're seeing, right? And I think if we're not willing to change our mindset and the way that we work together, we're not going to be able to fix this reliability problem that we're running into. We're fast and furious headed down this road where the grid is going to be less reliable than we've ever seen it. And so I just, I share the human story with you guys. I share that because I think it's really important for you guys to understand how impactful what you're doing really is. And, we're going to dig into the weeds on engineering over the next 2 days. But, the reliability of the grid is at stake here. 26 is going to be a very big year for us to get things right? To figure out how to deal with inverter-based resources. Cybersecurity was not on any of my talking points today, but that's, a whole another area, right, that we have to be thinking about. So, again, I want to say thank you to WEC for allowing me to be here. I think it's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I just I'm really passionate about figuring out how utilities and the renewable space can work together and how we can all support each other to have a more reliable grid. And that's definitely my work's passion is grid reliability. So, I'm really scared. I'm going to like open it up for questions here, but you guys are all going to be nice to me, right? I was trying really hard to like fill my time so that you wouldn't have questions for me. If some of you guys remember these past WEC conferences, the lines have gotten really long and really intense. So I'm gonna very scared, but I will open it up for questions for you guys, and I'll do my best to answer. Someone's coming. Hurry, trip him in the aisle. I'm just kidding. And just remember that, like, I'm standing, whatever your questions are, standing between you and lunch today, okay?
Fair enough. I'll keep it relatively brief. So Josh Aldridge, I'm with Ferrovial Energy US. We are a large developer, IPP. Specific to the hybridization, that's something that we tend to do as standard. But the largest question that we have, particularly in terms of how can we provide the best support, is something as simple as, what's the feeling for self-limiting facilities? What's your duration preference? Not, understanding that we do have to, it costs money for us to build these assets, right? But also in terms of general helpfulness, self-limiting facilities, what kind of duration? Do you guys get any feedback on that, right? From the utilities in particular, what do they want?
So raise your hand if you work in new resource at a utility and bringing new resources online. They're like, I'm not raising my hand right now.
Right.
But these are the folks where I think if you get to know them and have a relationship with them, you start to learn that stuff. But I think this is where we have opportunity as an industry to do a better job explaining what we need, right? That's why I brought up the California ISO's paper that they did on the BES, right, in 2024, because it did such a great job of saying, well, it gave an example. It was like, this battery storage site does all of these things and it operates, XYZ. And it was so helpful. And now that's informing what's happening, to every battery storage site in California right now, right? And I think that's a place where we have a gap, maybe that feels too strong of a word, but I think we can do a better job as an industry being more explicit about what we want to see, right? Because it's one thing to be like, oh, well, I'm compliant with PRC 19 and 24, so my inverters must be good. But is that really good? Like, what's that level, right? Like that's not the details that you need, right? Of how like this facility located in this one place. And I think that was like the conversation earlier on large load, right? It's like, well, how do you define a large load? Like a large load out in the middle of nowhere in a small town, could be nothing in a big facility. And so I think that's where we have work as an industry to do, to be more explicit as grid operator, putting on a grid operator hat to say, this is what we need. So, yeah. And I think some of it depends on where you're located too, where you're building. Because I think there's definitely in every, kind of BA, there's champions to reach out to. And we need more champions for sure. Not to not answer your question, but like.
It's helpful. It's going in the right direction. So we appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Kelly, we do have a question online.
Okay, let's do it.
So it says, thanks, Kelly, for the grid mix perspective. Wondering if there has been an identification of the number of units and megawatt retirements for the coal-related plants that have been confirmed to date that renewable units have replaced.
Okay, so I know there's a CS study that was done that has some data from 2024. I don't know if it's updated from 2025. I will have to look into that for you. I know that data has been pulled together. I will need to follow up with you guys on that one for sure. And that's a great question, but there is work around that, and there is data there. Someone in this room might have that answer off the tip of their tongue too. All right.
Hi, Kelly. James Hansen with WECC. So you had grid forming up there.
Jay's not here.
All right.
I'm just kidding.
So you said that you're in the room with a lot of these developers on a regular basis. So it's my understanding that a lot of the capability is there for grid forming, but not being implemented. Can you confirm that that's what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that. And, you know, some of that, it's really interesting because some of that is just an owner not knowing, right? Like you go in, you guys think about how a solar facility gets built, right? You go, you find some land, right? And you acquire some land and you're like, okay, I think we can do this. I think we got some money, right? So then you're like, oh, I'm going to go put myself in for a queue position, right? So you fill out the queue application form and then it says, check some boxes about the technical nature of your site. And depending on the developer, what they know or don't know, they're like, oh, well, I know some of these answers and some of these things I'm just going to check the box on and we'll figure it out later, right? They get in the interconnection queue, they get an interconnection agreement signed, and then they're like, okay, now we got to build this thing. And then they go to an EPC, an engineer procurement construction firm, and they say, here's the land plan, here's the interconnection agreement, here's what we think the offtake is going to look like. Write us a proposal and a contract for this facility. Well, what's in that EPC agreement? Procurement, right? So the EPC then is going and procuring all the equipment. So then the EPC goes over here to the inverter manufacturer and says, hey, I really want to win this bid. And I need to, I want to get this work done. Give me a price for these inverters. And the inverter manufacturer's like, okay, they never saw the interconnection agreement. They didn't understand the geography of where the site's being built or anything like that. And they're like, okay, here you go. Here's our best, here's our best price. And then the EPC wins and then they start building the project, right? And then you get all the way down here, you get initial sink at a facility, and now you got your first inverter coming online, right? First inverter's plugged into the site and the interconnection, whoever the operator is, they're like, whoa. Like, you got inverters here, you plugged them in, but they're not behaving how we thought they would in the interconnection study process, right? And then they're like, oh, well, we need you to change these settings, blah, blah, blah. So then the EPC goes back to the inverter manufacturer and is like, hey, need you to change all this stuff. The inverter manufacturer's like, well, you never told me that. And then you get stuck in change order ad nauseum forever fixing it, right? And then you're coming back and then you're coming to the inverter manufacturer and you're like, hey, can we actually make these grid forming? Oh yeah, let me just turn the button on for you.
Yeah.
But like, this is the process that we're dealing with, right? Like you have so many parties through this whole cycle of development, and you have these inverters that have great capabilities, but there was like this miscommunication about what was needed. And so we're seeing that over and over again where, we're getting that feedback back from the utility, right? And they're saying, hey, we need you to change these settings. Hey, this is not playing nice with our system. Come in and fix this. And then that's what happens. And that's why it's so important that time from initial sync, initial energization to COD is such a critical period of fine tuning the site to make sure that those inverters are working correctly, right? I don't know if you wanted the whole history lesson there, but I think it's important perspective.
That's good. So we've had conversations with a battery OEM. They had a test case in Hawaii, perfect place.
No NERC there
Yeah.
to be in trouble with.
Small system and everything. They turned their battery into grid forming.
Yeah.
There was a generation forced outage and caused oscillations on that system. They had to tune it. You're talking about, having to have the right settings in place. Even on a small system, they had to tune the batteries to be able to effectively be a grid forming resource. So when I look at the Western interconnection, it's more than just flipping a switch, because we have, it's very
I was a little
complex.
flippant when I said
No.
Sorry.
I get what you were saying there, though. But I think that grid forming is what we want these resources to be. I think it's a complex
Yes.
issue to make that a reality, though.
I
So
think there's some great work in the new standards coming forward with the category 2 work and what we're seeing with PRC 28. Like, I think we're headed in that right direction, right? And I think that's where, it's so important that we preserve this time between initial sync and COD, where entities can tune their system and not, that's the struggle. Like, if you had to be compliant right at energization, it's tough to get those inverters tuned, right? Because you think about a site, 9-acre site, a 200 megawatt site, it's going to have call it 40 inverters on site, right? You're going to, in solar, we deploy them in blocks, right? So you're going to like the first block, you finish your substation, get initial energization, and then you do your first block, right? You bring it on, you plug that inverter in, and you're like, oh, plays nicely with others. Cool. You get to inverter 3, and you're like, oh, it reset back to factory settings. What the heck is going on, right? And you're like, oh, does not play nicely with others. And so it's like every single one of those 40 inverters that come on is going to affect, right? And every inverter might have its own nuance, right? Where it's, you might be in an area where, it's definitely more of a shaded space on the site. And so that inverter needs to be tuned differently. So.
Thank you, Kelly.
We received another online question. How is the industry positioned on the grid forming technology with the 2026 implementation targets coming up?
I think it's interesting. I think if sites are being built right now, we're in a good place. I think there's a lot of historic sites that give me a lot of heartburn. If we think about things that, keep us folks in renewables from a compliance perspective up at night, it's those older sites, right? Like it's the sites that were built in 2012 and 2014 before any of this technology was deployed. It's the inverter OEM manufacturer that is no longer in business, doesn't know how to update those inverter settings, right? And now you're looking at potentially an inverter replacement or, a new commissioning that inverter in a new way. And that's really challenging for the industry to figure out how to do that. And I think you even have quite a bit of economic impact meeting those requirements as well. So it's definitely a challenging place to be getting those facilities compliant. If you're not already working and troubleshooting that, like you're going to be in a tough spot come May of 26. There's a lot of work to be done to get those older operating sites compliant. And then I also think, but if you have a site that's under new construction and you have a new inverter OEM, like you're benefiting from all the work we've done with the Category 1 assets over the last 10 years, right? And so then it's making it really easy for those folks to say, yep, this is a NERC site, I'll like a little behind the curtain, T-Mike, literally when you're signing your contract with them, they have an Excel spreadsheet that's like, these are the settings and these are the things, like this is how you want the inverters to behave. They literally have a box that says like, is this a NERC registered facility or not, right? Which is so cool that like T-Mike has gone to that place where they're like, oh, NERC registered facility. Okay, these inverters have to work, right? They have to meet these requirements, and that's really cool. This is an online question, so now I don't have anyone nodding their head telling me that I answered their question. It's kind of awkward. All right, you go.
Hey, this is Lennon Maran from Smart asking this question on behalf of Jenny from Tacoma.
Oh, he called you out.
So what kind of participation, involvement, and support are you seeing from the vendors to help the system operators with respect to application tools like, state estimation, RTCA, as they integrate this new IBRs and all this different resource mix?
Yeah, well, the RTAC, you meant like the RTAC, is that what you said?
I'm talking about real-time contingency analysis and state estimation and
Okay.
the tools which will help us,
Yes.
see what's going to happen tomorrow and next day.
Got it. Well, so I just, a couple of folks from my team were just at the ETAP summit over the last 2 weeks and in deep training. And, I got the email with the bill that said, hey, we need all these updates to our ETAP software so we can better model things because they now have a Category 2 application. Like we are seeing it in real time where people are updating their tools and are getting to a place where they can model things better and understand, how is that grid impact on the modeling side going for sure. I feel like vendors are really open to working with us. My experience with vendors, which maybe is just different, but I feel like whenever I go to a vendor and I'm like, hey, I'm like the NERC person, can I talk to you? Like, yes, please, we want to understand it. Like I end up giving NERC 101 like constantly to vendors because they want to understand like how does this work and how can they provide a better product? So we haven't seen a lot of resistance.
So how can we as the industry collaborate to make sure that it's just
Yeah.
not this vendor and not this vendor, but everybody is doing the same thing, right? We don't
Yeah.
have to worry about different solutions from different people.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it comes down to us all working together. Obviously, we're not going to have like a preferred vendor list or something like that, but I think we also know who the key people are. I think we all, as an industry, should do a really good job contracting, right? Like if you're contracting for a vendor that's providing some sort of tool or device that's supporting reliability, that you have requirements in your contracts with those vendors, right? Like every inverter contract, every SCADA contract that our owners sign, they have a NERC exhibit in every single one of their contracts that says, this is the NERC requirements for this facility, and this is what you need to comply with. And, and then there's teeth in the contract. So if they're not complying, or they provided you with a piece of equipment that is providing a reliability risk, that you have teeth in that contract to come back to them and say, hey, you need to fix this. Right? Like you said this was going to be compliant and it's not. What is your plan of action? Right? And I think it starts with that initial contracting thing. And I think a lot of us are like, oh, legal's over here. And, we don't understand how legal works. And we just tell procurement that we need X, right? But we need to get more involved in that process, because the more vendors start to see that requirement come through contracts, I think is going to make a really big impact.
Another question says, it's my understanding that the new PRC 28, 29, and 30 standards are to ensure that entities monitor and record IBR values. Is there any plan to create standard requirements to monitor and regulate behavior?
Where are WEC auditors in the room right now? And how are you going to audit us on PRC 28 and 29? Come on, raise your hands. I'll go back. So let's take it out of something that's maybe a little bit of a hot take topic. Let's take PRC 5. How do you show compliance with PRC 5? What do you need to do? Well, okay, you need a program, you need a spreadsheet. Cool, but what do you really need? Anyone? Test records, right? You need test records. You need to actually show that you're compliant, that you're actually doing the thing, right? So how are you going to show compliance with PRC 28 and 29 if you're not recording and taking that information and creating an evidence package? Again, like I'm not the auditor. I don't know that we've had enough of an industry position on this. Like I don't want to overstep or opine where I think it's still a little bit unclear. But I think if you go back to the fundamental practices of what we're doing for a compliance program, it is say this is what you're going to do what you say, and back it up and show how you're going to do it. Like every single standard, every single time. So when you're looking at PRC 28 and 29, what are you doing? You're going to do this study and you're going to say our equipment is going to behave this certain way, right? So then you need to be going and saying, okay, before I hit COD, before I hit NERC registration, is the equipment behaving correctly? How can I prove it? And file the documentation away and you're good to go. And it doesn't matter what an auditor is going to ask you. You did what you said you were going to do. You did the reliable thing, and then you proved it, and you had the documentation. I don't want to oversimplify it. Yeah, we don't know in audit practice exactly what it's going to look like. But at the end of the day, as an industry, we have to build trust with each other and trust with our auditors and have that conversation. I mean, I think there's a lot of us in the room that be like, hey, I'll be the first to be audited on PRC 28 because I'm doing what I think is the right thing. And let's work together to figure out what the evidence package should look like, and there's not enough of that in this industry. And that's how we get better. So. Sorry, I didn't have a magic bullet for that one.
All right, thank you, Kelly. If everyone could give her a round of applause.